moderator's role is a delightful role, particularly since I was instructed to simply name the person and not give an introduction, because that's in your book. Quite a lot of information about each person. So to allow the maximum amount of time for each speaker, I will simply turn the floor over to them, and they will get some type of visual message when their time is running out. And so, unless there's some objection, I'll take it in the order it appears. Paul Gilbert will speak on the components of compassion.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, CCARE and Dr. Doherty, for inviting me. This is a great honor to come from England, and a little bit trepidatious following Dr. Ekman's brilliant talk, particularly with a talk called Components of Compassion. Now, I'm a clinician, so I will be giving a clinical flavor to this, but tomorrow is where we'll be looking more in terms of the psychotherapy. So right now, we're just going to be focusing on the components. And as I say, I came to this through a clinical focus. In the Compassionate Mind Foundation, we always like to give a little bit of compassionate advice. It's a nice little story. So, if at first you don't succeed, skydiving is not for you. Okay, so how did I get into this? Well, I was very interested in the concept of nurturance. During the 1980s, I wanted to understand a little bit about the psychology of nurturing, because certainly in clinical work, we find that many of our clients have a lot of difficulty with nurturing, sometimes nurturing others, but very often nurturing themselves. And I was very attracted to Alan Fogle's model of caring, and he defines caring in the following way. And I love this sort of statement because it sort of has a lot of feeling like lawyers. You can't really understand it unless you read it, many times. So the provision of guidance, protection, and care for the purpose of fostering developmental change congruent with the expected potential for change of the object of nurturance. It's wonderful, isn't it? But actually it contains some very interesting wisdoms. And what they went on to say is that nurturing involves the following: an awareness of the need to be nurturing, the motivation to nurture, expression of nurturing feelings, understanding what is needed to be nurturing, matching what is given with what is required, and feedback from the impact of what you do. So you don't just keep doing the same thing, you're able to kind of track and monitor what you're doing. So those are the beginning of thinking about the components of nurturing and caring. And back in the 80s, this is where I kind of began, and I then talked about the concept of self-nurturance, the ability to have all of those qualities, the awareness that you need to look after yourself, the ability to do that, the motivation to do that, and so on. But in fact, compassion involves something slightly more than caring, because what also Alan Fogle pointed out is that you can care for your garden, you can care for your car, you can care for a work of art. But compassion is more than caring in the sense that it focuses on suffering. And if we think about some of the early ideas of suffering, one of them, of course, is Aristotle's. And Aristotle's idea of compassion is something that sort of filters through the European concepts of compassion. And he said that the compassion is based on a number of cognitive elements. The first cognitive element of compassion is the belief that the suffering is serious and not trivial, and he gave various examples for that. The second is the belief that the person does not deserve to suffer. Now that's an interesting concept because the issue of deserve comes up time and again when we think about suffering. And the third is the belief of the possibilities that the person who experiences the emotions is similar to the sufferer, and that's the empathic dimension. The Buddhist position, however, is different to the Aristotelian position. The Buddhist position is based on this heartfelt wish for all sentient beings to be free from suffering. This is something that Dr. Ekman talked about in his talk. And this relates to what Matthew Ricard says is a deep feeling and understanding of the suffering of others associated with a deep commitment and responsibility to try to alleviate it. So this is very much a suffering focus. In the Buddhist traditions, there is this concept of bodhicitta, and bodhicitta is the way in which we develop the internal seeds of compassion or the motivation within ourselves. It is the central tenet of Buddhist training. Bodhicitta is the essence of all Buddhist practice. The word bodhicitta itself explains so much. Bodhi is Sanskrit for awake or awaking, and citta is for mind. So as enlightenment is the state of being fully awakened, precious mind of bodhicitta is the mind that is starting to become completely awakened in order to benefit all other beings. There are two aspects to this mind, the aspiration to benefit others and the wish to obtain complete enlightenment or wisdom in order to do that. And this is a theme I'm going to kind of follow up with as I go through the next few minutes. The idea that compassion then is multi-component is not new. This is a 2,000-year-old concept. The question is, what are the components? Now, Christine Feldman and Willem Kuyken, in their work on compassion, says, compassion is a multi-textured response to pain, sorrow, and anguish. It includes kindness, empathy, generosity, and acceptance. The strands of courage, something I'm going to stress in a moment, tolerance, equanimity are equally woven into the cloth of compassion. Above all, compassion is the capacity to open to the reality of suffering and to aspire to its healing. So here again, we see these two basic psychologies coming through in these definitions. Now, Geshe Jimpa, who is here and has, of course, developed the compassionate cultivation training program, which is a fantastic program here at CCARE, they define compassion in terms of four elements: an awareness of suffering, a sympathetic concern to be emotionally moved by suffering, a wish, this heartfelt wish to see the relief of suffering, a responsiveness or readiness to help to alleviate that suffering. So once again, you see these multi-components to this idea of compassion. And this is Dr. Ekman's overview that he gave just now, the concept of empathic compassion, action compassion, concerned compassion, aspirational compassion, and how these can be related to the now, alleviating now, but also to do with prevention. In fact, the whole point of doing mindfulness and mind training and training in bodhicitta is preventative. The idea is it's what happens in the future. So this brings us to the two psychologies, which is the a model that we've been working on for some years. And the definition that we take is this as a sensitivity to the suffering of self, because that's important, and others, with a deep commitment to try to relieve and prevent it. This concept of prevention is also very important, and as I say, that's the whole point of doing that training in mindfulness or whatever. So the two psychologies then are to approach, to understand, and to engage with suffering. Don't look away from it, but also to look into the causes of suffering. This is really important within the Buddhist traditions, to see the causes of suffering, and sometimes that takes courage. The second psychology is what Dr. Ekman would call the action component. That is to work to alleviate, to prevent suffering. And that requires the acquiring of the wisdom and the skills to do so, and that's dedication. Why are you all here today? You're all here today to listen about compassion, to learn about compassion. So this is the second psychology of compassion. Wanting to be a doctor is great, but then you have to study for X number of years in order to do that competently. The preparedness to commit yourself to the work, to acquire the wisdom, so that you can act with wise compassion, is part of compassion. Compassion is also relational. There's the compassion that we give to others, and again, Dr. Ekman talks about this, and that requires various competencies, and there are facilitators and inhibitors to that. It's easier to be compassionate to people you like than people you don't like. But compassion is also relational. So there are some compassions that you're not going to see, I care about you, lion. I care about you too, zebra. So being compassionate, there are facilitators and inhibitors. And in terms of giving compassion, in terms of receiving compassion, which of course, as therapists, we're very interested in that. How do people experience compassion? Once again, we can see that there are facilitators and there are inhibitors. Some individuals find it very difficult to receive compassions. They look at me and they say, yes, Dr. Gilbert, you're compassionate to me because you're paid to do it. But if you really knew what went on in my head, you would not be compassionate to me. If you really knew what I'd done in the past, you would not be compassionate to me. So the facilitators and inhibitors are the ability to experience and to allow compassion to land in you, that also is a very important area of research. We also know, that giving compassion, and again, Dr. Ekman touched on this, can be related to all kinds of emotions. For example, if you see a baby crying in a burning house and you run into the house to save the baby, I think most people would think of that as a compassionate act. But in that moment, you are not in a state of quiescence or quietness. You can be very frightened. You could be, and sometimes people can be very compassionate out of anger, out of a sense of injustice. So giving compassion then can be stimulated by various emotions. Receiving compassion, on the other hand, does tend to have the impact of calming, soothing. It's linked to parasympathetic activity, which Dr. Porges will be talking about later today. But once again, there are facilitators and inhibitors of this. So the things that will facilitate and inhibit you in terms of receiving and experiencing compassion are liking or not liking. If somebody you like gives you a hug and says, "How are you?" that's nice. If somebody you really don't like very much tries to give you a hug, that's you straighten, you stiffen. The ability to feel that you are similar to others, all the things that Dr. Ekman spoke earlier. The issue of deservedness, the Aristotelian idea. Empathic, the ability to be empathic, to be able to mentalize. Dissociation. We use dissociation from suffering all the time. We simply switch off from it because if you really engage with the suffering of the world, it can be somewhat overwhelming. Anxiety and depression have an impact on your ability to both give and to receive compassion. Your ability to respond to distress. Are you easily overwhelmed by the distress of others? Or can you tolerate the distress of others? So all of those things are important. And in terms of it being a motivation, we know that there are a whole series of processes that influence motivations, whatever they are. For example, having insight into the nature of what your motivation is. Doing it voluntarily rather than feeling you have to do it. Seeing if there's a payoff, a rapid payoff, enjoying it or not enjoying it. Getting social support in what you do versus feeling you have to go it alone. Being competent, knowing what you're doing rather than you don't know what you're doing. Gaining the positive versus avoiding the negative. These are all things that are very important in basic motivation, and therefore it's very important within compassion too. And as Dr. Ekman was saying, these are all very important research questions. So coming very quickly then to the model that we use in my last 3 minutes, it's the two psychologies. What are the two psychologies? What are the components of the two psychologies? Well, firstly is the motivation. Motivation is key. You saw it in the Bodhicitta, the desire to address suffering, okay? The second is the ability to pay attention, to be sensitive to what it is that you're motivated. So you learn paying attention to the cues of suffering rather than just dissociating. Sympathy, there's a lot of dispute about words such as sympathy and emotional empathy, but sympathy is the ability to simply emotionally resonate. You know, without having a cognitive process, it's the immediate emotional resonance. But again, I'm a little hesitant here because Dr. Batson is the world expert on empathy, so I don't want to tread too heavily in this area. Distress tolerance is very important because if you can't tolerate distress, be it your own distress or the distress of others, then you become dissociative, you become avoidant. Empathy is important because it allows you to make sense of what's going on. But remember, empathy has to be linked to the motivation because empathy with a negative motivation can be quite destructive. The worst torture to have is an empathic one. If you're asked, always choose the non-empathic one. And non-judgment, of course, which is the ability to be present with whatever it is that arises, whatever it is you encounter. And then the second psychology, so that's the first psychology, and when we do therapy, we help people with all of these different components. So what about the action component? Well, it's learning to pay attention to what is helpful, knowing what is helpful. It's using reasoning. You know, compassion is not stupid. Compassion depends on wisdom, the ability to think about. Again, Dr. Ekman was talking about the fact that if we only rely on our emotions, then we're likely to be compassionate to people we like rather than those we don't like. But the strongest, the most important compassion are for the people we don't like. It's for the difficult things. Can you be compassionate to the things you don't like in yourself, for example, the things you're ashamed of? Can you use your reason to understand why that's important? Compassionate feeling can be various, as we spoke about, and compassionate behavior often depends on courage. Without courage, you're not going to be able to act. And yet action is often central to compassion. In training, we also do imagery work and so forth. Now, compassion, therefore, is about descending into the reality of the dark side of humanity. It's not about ascending up. Compassion isn't becoming this sort of holy person walking around like this. Compassion is the ability to acquire the courage to face the pain and suffering. The human brain is problematic to humans. The way it has evolved means that we are capable of great compassion, but we are probably one of the cruelest, nastiest species that have ever walked this earth. If you look at the last 5,000 years, the things we've done to each other are just nightmare. We are the creators of hell. We are the firework of hell. And we have to wake up to this reality because we have a choice of if we can descend and understand the dynamics of that. We have Dr. Zimbardo, he's done brilliant work, the Lucifer effect, remember that, the context that bring out the worst in you. Then maybe we can start to develop the things that bring out the best in you. But compassion is the courage to descend into the reality of being. And so, just to finish in the last 4 seconds, we need to also think about compassion and how compassion operates in all these different domains. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time.
And now we will hear from Felix Warneken.
Let us imagine the following situation. You're walking across the parking lot of your local grocery store, and it's raining, and there's this person standing behind the car, umbrella in one hand, car keys in another hand, the grocery bags under the elbows, and then suddenly the car keys drop on the ground and loud clatter. What would you do in this situation? I believe, at least I hope, that many of you would walk over there, pick up the keys, and maybe open the trunk so that this poor fellow can put the groceries into the trunk. So where does this come from? Where does this tendency come from to not always care only about our own motives, but also to, at least under some circumstances, adopt the goals of other people and altruistically act on behalf of other people's goals rather than your own goals? One plausible alternative, one plausible hypothesis where this might come from is that we've learned it from our parents. So we have been rewarded for being nice. We have been scolded at if we are not caring about other people. More generally, there are very strong social values attached to altruistic behaviors. So it's very plausible that we, over development, absorbed all these kinds of social values and they have become part of our bodies, as it were. But this took a very long time, and we were maybe not starting out to be that way. It was more external forces that shaped us in this direction. And there's very good reason to believe that this is true to some extent, because if this was just purely automatic, why would there be these social values, right? And studies with adults also show that we are very sensitive to, for example, the reputation of our behaviors, right? That we are very sensitive to the extent to what other people will think about us if we do or don't do a certain thing. But all of this does not necessarily mean that the starting state of these kinds of behaviors are characterized by these complex processes already. So how can we find out? How can we learn what aspects of this tendency to help other people is due to something that is more spontaneous? And to what extent is this due to something that is due to internalizing, what we call it in psychology, of social norms and social values? So what I want to do today is show you some evidence with young children. Because when we study young children, we can learn something about these earliest forms and see what might be there before culture with all these norms and concerns about reputation could have had a major impact. So let's look at one example. So what you see here is an 18-month-old toddler, and he observes how I am standing there on the right in this split screen, hanging towels on the clothesline. And then I accidentally drop a clothespin on the floor, and I'm unsuccessfully reaching for it. And so what we observed is that these 18-month-olds would perform this kind of behavior in what you saw here, the experimental condition in which I needed help. And they would do that very frequently. In more than 60% of instances in which this happened, they would lend a helping hand. You might think, well, maybe they are obsessive compulsive, they don't like that clothespins are on the floor, or they just want to interact with me in any kind of way, or maybe they give it to me so that I repeat the action. But this is why we included a so-called control condition with the same basic physical situation, but I had a very different goal in mind. So in the control condition, I would just stand there and throw clothespins on the floor on purpose. And in this case, children would not pick it up and give it back to me, so it's not the case that they think clothespins don't belong on the floor or they just want to interact with me. It seems like it really has something to do with my unfulfilled goal. So when we had these initial results, we were then wondering, how clever are children? Will they be able to help in somewhat more difficult situations where they don't have to bring something back, but maybe help with putting stuff away? So what we did is we created this cabinet task where you will see me walking from the right to the left. So the first time I put a stack of magazines into the cabinet and closed the doors. Then I went to the other end of the room to get another stack of magazines, and then this happens. So what we found was that children would help in this situation as well, not quite as much as in the simpler version, but even when it is a somewhat complex situation like a cabinet door being in my way, they will help in the experimental condition you saw here, but wouldn't open it ever in a control condition in which I first had put the magazines on top of the cabinet. And when I now return and bump into it, it was not because I tried to put it inside, but because I tried to put it on top, right? And in this situation, when the doors were not an obstacle to my goal, they would not open it, so it's not that they were just reminded of how much fun it is to open cabinets. It seems like they were really doing it in order to help me. So these are two of the many examples we have, but what is a commonality amongst them is that you could say that maybe they've encountered this at home, right? And maybe they've been told to do something, what to do in this kinds of situation. So in another experiment, what we did is we created a situation that the children could not have encountered before by introducing a box that we built. And this box had a hole on top and a flap on the side. And another experimenter first showed the child how to use the flap to retrieve something from inside, so they've learned that. And then later, I come into the room with this box, and I have a cup of tea and a spoon. And then I accidentally drop the spoon through the hole, and I'm awkwardly trying to squeeze my hand through it to get my spoon back. Oh. And so again, what we found was that in the experimental condition in which I needed help, children would provide it, but they would not open the box in a control condition in which I first threw the spoon through the hole on purpose and did not reach for it. So it's not the case that children just want to use this newly acquired skill. It seems like it really has something to do with my goal. So what we see here is that children are quite clever helpers because they can infer in novel kinds of situations what the problem is and how to intervene. And importantly, they do that spontaneously. So in all of these situations, children would help within seconds. It's not that I had to solicit their helping very much. However, what you saw was there was maybe some kind of solicitation in the sense of someone's reaching for something or bumping into the doors, which could be construed as some kind of communication to say, like, help me with this, even if there's no eye contact. So would children help when these cues are absent? Would they help in a situation where they would have to provide proactive help, as I would say? So they proactively have to infer what is needed in this situation without any communication from the other person. So what we did to investigate this is we created the following situation. So that's like a bird's eye view of our experimental testing room where E1, the experimenter 1, is in front of these two tables here in gray and is putting milk cans into a box. And while she's doing that, the child on the left is playing with a fun toy and can observe what's going on. But then what happens is that out of the experimenter's sight, without her even seeing it, one of these cans is rolling off the table. So the question is, will children walk over there and help even though the person didn't even realize that there was a problem and obviously was not able to solicit any help from that child? So that's one complication. But there's a second complication. The child is playing with a fun toy. So this is also a difference to the prior studies that I showed you, where you could say, well, maybe the children didn't have anything better to do than to help, right? Because they were just hanging out with mom. Like, how much fun is that? But so in this situation, they really have to pay a cost, at least an opportunity cost, because they have to disengage from this fun toy. So here is the situation, the real situation. On the right, you see the two tables, and the child is playing with the zigzag ramp. And on the far right, you will then see how a can is falling on the ground.
That one here. And then let's see, I've got this one. For the big box, I guess. Put that here. And then here's a small one. Put that here. And then here's another, let's see, these are the same size. Let's put that here. And put this one here.
All right. So what we observed is that at least starting around 2 years of age, children are competent enough to help in this situation without any solicitation, and even though they have to disengage from this fun activity in order to help. So the studies show the flexibility, the spontaneity, and also that children are willing to pay a cost. The flip side of cost, obviously, is benefit. So to what extent do children expect that they receive a benefit from their helping act? So what we did in one study was that, once again, a person dropped stuff on the ground and was reaching for it. But now we compared two different groups of children. One group of children was in one condition where they always received a reward for helping. So the person was reaching for the object, but was holding out a toy that she would give once the child has traded the dropped object with them. So they would be paid in some sense. And the other group of children also were in this situation, but the person never rewarded them, never offered a reward for the helping act, and then we would compare what they would do. So we have one treatment condition with rewards and another treatment condition without rewards, and then in the second phase, all the children saw the same situation, a person reaching for a dropped object and not offering a reward. So what did we see during this second phase? Here are the results. Children who never received a reward continued to help at a very high rate, but those children who had previously received a reward that was no longer forthcoming were now less inclined to help. So this is what you know from the social psychology literature as the over-justification effect, or in behavioral economics, crowding out, where a previous intrinsic motivation is supplanted by an extrinsic situation, and so this undermines this initial motivation and does not sustain it in the future. So with all these studies together, I think we're in a fairly good position to challenge the view that it's due to socialization practices and rewards and all these kinds of things alone that we develop altruistic inclinations. So the view that we kind of have to be reprogrammed from pure selfishness into altruistic tendencies, that does not seem to apply. However, you could still argue, well, these children had like almost 1.5 years to learn it. So maybe we care so much about raising altruistic offspring that so much is put there early on, and this is still the reason. Or maybe we just couldn't really detect the kinds of subtle socialization practices that adults use very early in life. So what can we do to rule that out? This is where chimpanzees come into play. So I obviously will not be able to walk you through all the studies that we ran with chimpanzees. So I will have to, you have to take my word for it and maybe read some of the literature, which shows that when we ran the same basic helping tests with chimpanzees that we developed for young children, we find the following. Also, chimpanzees help spontaneously without getting a reward. They do it in these out-of-reach situations. They do it also in an equivalent to the cabinet task, indicating that they also have some cognitive flexibility to help in different kinds of situations, including novel kinds of situations for which they could not have been trained. They do help humans, which we need to do to some extent to perform these standardized experimental tests, but we also find that they would help conspecifics like in an equivalent to the cabinet task. However, they do not show this, what I called proactive helping tendency. So when we put them in tests where there's no cue from the recipient, they do not seem to provide the help. At the moment, we don't know exactly why that is the case, whether this is due to some maybe cognitive limitation to read the situation properly, or is it the case that they need this extra nudge from the recipient to, like, at least non-verbally indicate, like, hey, I need help here, do something, right? So we don't know it's cognitive or motivational or both, but we can say that, like, the basic tendency to help is present in chimpanzees as we find it in very young children. So what's the conclusion from that? I think the conclusion from this is that because one of our closest evolutionary relatives also displays these behaviors, it seems that this is something that's evolutionarily ancient. It's not a human-unique capacity that developed before the common ancestor split into what is now contemporary chimpanzees and is contemporary Homo sapiens, but that maybe the common ancestors of chimpanzees and humans already possessed some of these basic traits. So this is more evidence to suggest that there is more to altruism than just socialization. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Daniel Batson, who's going to talk on empathy and altruism hypothesis.
Thanks, Paul. Felix's slides, pictures are wonderful, and unfortunately, I'm going to show you slides that are pictures only of words. So I hope, let me ask that you use your imagination to be able to generate the examples and things that may go with the words. I've spent a number of years working on what I've called the empathy-altruism hypothesis. It's certainly not new to me. It's been around for a while, but I hope what may be a little bit new is I actually think we've been able to test this effectively. But what I'd like to do today is talk about what that hypothesis is, and importantly also what it's not, because rather than trying to give you a comprehensive taxonomy, I'm going to try to give you a bit of a laser focus if I can, and then so what? So how do we do this thing? Oh, I see. Okay. So first, the hypothesis simply says empathic concern produces altruistic motivation to relieve the empathy-inducing need, which is quite simple and direct, I hope, But whether that hypothesis is even worth testing, I would suggest, depends on what you mean by empathic concern and what you mean by altruistic motivation. And so I want to be clear about those and what I don't mean. So first, in the hypothesis, altruism is a motivational state with the ultimate goal of increasing another's welfare. So I'm talking about motivation, and I'm talking about a state, not a general trait of the person, with the ultimate goal of increasing another's welfare. And by an ultimate goal, I don't mean like a metaphysical first final cause or evolutionary function. I'm talking about simply what a person is after in the situation. And people can have multiple ultimate goals in a given situation. So this is a goal of increasing another's welfare, but it's juxtaposed to egoism, motivational state with the ultimate goal of increasing one's own welfare. So there is a debate within Western thought that's gone on for centuries, the egoism-altruism debate, and that's what it hinges on. The issue is, if you take examples of helping like Felix presented, if benefiting the other is an ultimate goal, that would be an altruistic motive, but benefiting the other could be an instrumental goal, that is a means to the ultimate goal of benefiting the self. And he talked about some possibilities with material rewards. He didn't really focus too much on social rewards, which I think may be crucial for the studies he's talking about, but we'll have to talk about that later. So what is altruism not, according to this? Well, first thing, it's not just helping behavior. That's acting with intent to benefit. That doesn't tell us whether the motive is egoistic or altruistic. It's not helping in order to gain internal rather than external rewards. So we also have to consider the possibility that a person is doing this to feel good about themselves or to avoid feeling guilt. Those would be egoistic motives, again. It's not self-sacrificial behavior. Self-sacrificial behavior is cost to me, not benefit to other. The definition of altruism is on benefit to the other. And it's not behavior that reduces one's relative reproductive fitness. This is the evolutionary definition of altruism. And the idea is if an organism engages in a behavior that reduces the likelihood of them putting their genes in the next generation, that would be altruistic. I don't think that's necessary for what I'm talking about, what is sometimes called psychological altruism, that is this motivational state with the ultimate goal of increasing another's welfare. Okay, so what about empathic concern? What is it in this hypothesis? An other-oriented emotional elicited by and congruent with the perceived welfare of someone in need. So I'm talking about a reaction to the perceived welfare, not to a reaction to another person's emotional state. The other person could be unconscious and feeling nothing, and you could still feel empathic concern as I'm defining it. So it includes feelings that people talk about, at least, as sympathy, compassion, tenderness. We may want to differentiate special meanings of compassion. Most people, at least in our subject populations, don't make that kind of distinction. The crucial thing is it's feeling for the other person, concern for the other person. That's what I mean by other-oriented, not feeling as the other person feels. So that gets us into another string of what it's not. It's not knowing another person's thoughts and feelings. These are all things that have been talked about as empathy. And I'm not trying to say that you can't talk about these things as empathy. That's fine. I'm just saying that's not what empathy is in this hypothesis. It's not adopting the posture that is motor mimicry or shared neural representations. It's not coming to feel as the other person feels. It's not feeling distress when you see the other person is suffering. It's feeling for the other person, not being distressed by their distress. It's not, there are two forms of perspective taking that have been talked about sometimes as empathy. One is imagining how you would think and feel in the other person's place, walking a mile in their moccasins. It's not even imagining how the other person thinks and feels. That perspective taking, imagining how the other feels, is often used to induce empathy or empathic concern. But it's not the same thing. It's also not a general disposition or trait. There may be such traits. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about empathy as a feeling in a given situation, not a disposition to feel. That may very well exist. It's just not what's in the definition. So if we go back to this hypothesis then that empathic concern as defined, this other-oriented feeling for, produces altruistic motivation, a motivational state with the ultimate goal of increasing another's welfare. I guess one question is the hypothesis even worth testing? And I think it is. It's basically a question about human nature. What's our capacity for caring? Can we care about other people's welfare to any degree other than because it affects us? Okay, and so I'll assume the hypothesis is worth testing. I've wasted 50 years if it's not. So to date, there are over 35 experiments that have been conducted to test this hypothesis against various egoistic alternatives. And this gets very complex. I could wish I could represent these experiments with 2 bars. That would be wonderful, but I can't. And I'm not going to run you through 35 experiments. The results have been strongly supportive. If you want to see the nitty-gritties, there's a reference. And I think the only reasonable conclusion is that tentatively the hypothesis seems to be true, that empathic concern produces altruistic motivation. But let me go quickly to, okay, so where does empathic concern come from then? And what I would suggest is evolutionarily, it may be that empathic concern is a generalization off of parental care. I think that's probably the most likely hypothesis in terms of its genetic basis. But in the situation, I think it's 2 things: perception of the other as a need and valuing the other's welfare, that those are the key antecedent components that produce this feeling for the other, which produces the altruistic motivation, Okay. So that gets us into just mentioning a number of factors that affect the antecedents but aren't sufficient for empathic concern. And I'm going to run through these really fast. That is, you can look at the list, and so things like similarity, prior experience, shared group membership, all of those things, they can affect each of these components, I think. The N's are for the need component, the V's for value components, but I don't think they're either necessary or sufficient to produce empathic concern. So that's a thumbnail sketch of the what of the hypothesis, the so what. And what I want to do, I'm going to jump right past all of this. These so whats were going to be the ones for which we've got research that suggest both benefits and liabilities. And here are some benefits. I'm going to run past them because I'm running out of time already. Here are liabilities. Let me just mention a couple of these quickly, because often people assume, gee, altruism, it must be all good, and that ain't so, I don't think. One is that, first, not all needs evoke empathic concern. Environmental needs, things like that, may not evoke this empathic emotions. So it's not good for everything. It can also lead to what I call empathy avoidance, and I think Daryl will probably talk more about that sort of an idea. That is, if we know that empathic concern can lead us to an altruistic motive, well, there are costs that can be associated with acting on an altruistic motive. And so we may actually avoid feeling empathy in order to avoid the motivation, so forth. It can also lead to immoral action. If our goal is to benefit this other, increase this other's welfare, sometimes that can lead us to violate our own moral principles. For example, in cases of nepotism, things like that. What I want to do very quickly is talk about possible implications of the empathy-altruism research for a science of compassion, both the content of a science of compassion and the conduct. And so the question is, might compassion training broaden the benefits, limit the liabilities? And that has been suggested. Matthew Ricard is one of the people that suggested it. And there's reason to think that maybe it should. Loving kindness meditation seems designed to extend the range of others whose welfare is valued, even to enemies, all sentient beings, as Paul mentioned earlier. That focuses on the value antecedent, it seems to me. That is, it should broaden those others whose welfare we value. The compassion meditation, designed to increase sensitivity to others' needs, it amplifies the need antecedent. It probably affects the value antecedent as well. So if meditation has those effects, the results should be, I think, an extension of empathic concern and empathy-induced altruism beyond its normal limits, because there are limits in most of us. We should see increases in the range of targets for whom empathic concern is felt, the breadth of the motivation, the sensitivity of the behavioral response. And Matthew has called this an altruistic disposition. That is, that's what we should get. Does it have those effects? Well, there are many impressive stories that would suggest it may. There's also some suggestive empirical evidence, and here are some examples. Reports of loving kindness meditation, loving kindness or compassion meditation led to more positive feelings towards same-sex strangers, decreased intergroup bias, increased willingness to right or wrong in a dictator game, increased willingness to give one's seat to an injured person. As you can see, a lot of these studies are very, very recent. This is a research area that's just starting. They're certainly encouraging, but so far I would say the evidence hasn't provided a persuasive answer to the question of whether meditation practices can extend empathic concern and empathy-induced altruism, and I think we need better empirical tests. Okay, so how do we get better tests? I would suggest that the research designed to test the empathy-altruism hypothesis may suggest two principles that we might want to follow. The first is we need to assess our predicted outcomes as directly as possible. And that is, we need to test our predictions, not proxies for those predictions. And there's been a tendency to sort of substitute an easier measure. If we're talking about motivational effects, measuring behavior is not enough. We've got to go after the motives, which is not an easy job, but it's doable. Second, I think we need to find, if we find supportive data, we need to look for and test contrary explanations, both methodological and theoretical ones. That is, what we need to do is test for disconfirmation, not for confirmation. And the studies we've got so far are primarily directed towards finding support, making it look good, and we really need to go after. But maybe, even if it looks good, it's not as good as it looks. We need to consider that. And I think only then will we have a science of compassion that goes beyond preaching to the choir. Thanks.
Our last speaker, Daryl Cameron, is going to talk on motivation, capacity, and the limits of compassion.
This is a very tough act to follow. I appreciate the invitation to be here. I'm going to try to give you two talks for the price of one. So I've been asked to discuss measures of compassion. So I'm going to briefly touch upon a collaboration that my lab has been conducting with Stanford CCARE to advance measurement of compassion. And then I'll touch upon the issue that was the original title of the talk, Motivation, Capacity, and Compassion's Limits. So first, what I want to focus on is what is compassion? How do we measure it? And I thought that to start us off, I would give us an experiential, lived sense of what compassion might feel like. This is an induction drawn from Dr. Keltner's research group. So just as you're going through this, focus on what you're thinking, how you're feeling viscerally. And that's the one that always gets me. I'm really more of a cat person, so this maybe not so much for me personally. So the state you might be feeling has been defined as compassion. Gates, Keltner, and Simon Thomas define this as the feeling that arises in witnessing others' suffering that motivates a desire to help. It's also been called empathic concern and sympathy. And as Dan mentioned nicely, it predicts a variety of positive social outcomes, things ranging from cooperation to pro-social behavior to forgiveness. And yet, despite the agreement that compassion has these positive qualities and consequences, there's not necessarily a clear consensus about the best way to measure it. If I were trying to understand how much compassion you felt after that slideshow, I could have simply asked you, on a 1 to 5 scale, how much compassion are you currently feeling? Now, that does allow you to capture the discrete experience of an emotion quite efficiently, but it might have its limits. It might be that there are certain desirability biases that might constrain the reliability of that response. I could have assessed your helping behavior. I could have asked you to make a donation to the victims that were portrayed in that slideshow. But, as we have seen, helping behavior is multi-determined. In a variety of states aside from compassion, both affective and non-affective could produce those kinds of outcomes. I could have assessed physiological reactions, or I could have put you in a brain scanner, that level of analysis is a little bit less reactive, but there might be some difficulty in isolating discrete emotions on those levels of analysis. So self-reports can provide discreteness, but they're kind of reactive. Physiology and brain imaging can provide us something less reactive, but it's harder to get discreteness. So is there a method that can capitalize on the advantages of both approaches? I wouldn't ask that question if I didn't have an answer. I want to argue that implicit measures of evaluation from social cognition research are one potentially useful tool that can expand the toolboxes of researchers who study compassion. So these are tests that capture our immediate, spontaneous, automatic reactions towards social stimuli. They are designed to bypass response correction and capture responses that are difficult to control. Perhaps the most well-known example, the implicit association test, often used to diagnose implicit racial bias. What I'm going to talk about is a different test, the affect misattribution procedure, or AMP for short. So this is the AMP. This is a sample trial. Basically, you complete a series of trials which have 3 successive images. First, you have the prime image, in this case, the laughing baby. Perhaps it elicits a positive affective response. Then you have a second image that is an ambiguous Chinese symbol. It's an emotionally ambiguous Chinese symbol, at least for those who can't read Chinese. We do exclude their data if they can read Chinese, obviously. And what happens, and people are told to judge, is the symbol pleasant or unpleasant, and to avoid being influenced by the initial prime image. Now, what happens is a process called affect misattribution. People mistakenly confuse their affective reaction towards the laughing baby for their reaction to the target pictograph. So if you have a positive reaction to the baby, you're going to judge the pictograph as pleasant. So this has been widely used to assess implicit attitudes towards a variety of topics, predicts behavior quite nicely, and what we wanted to do is to try to see if we can use this to measure compassion. Can we adapt this task to measure emotion-specific misattribution and use it to predict a variety of compassion-related outcomes? So the structure is essentially the same. I tell you these Chinese characters are meant to elicit a variety of emotions. Judge whether the target symbol elicits compassion is one option, disgust is a second option, and no feeling is a third option. So if that's a picture of my 2-year-old son, and he's crying, I might have a compassion reaction, and I might then misattribute that specific emotional response as being due to the Chinese symbol. Now, if that's someone else's crying son, I could care less, and maybe I'll misattribute disgust instead. That made me sound like a really bad person, didn't it? I apologize if you have 2-year-old sons, or children of any kind. Okay. Yeah. So this is preliminary data. This is fresh off the presses. So this is a collaboration with a bunch of folks at CCARE, also my grad student Victoria Spring, who's giving a poster on this tomorrow, which I encourage you to attend. So people completed the compassion version of the AMP, as I just described. They completed direct emotion ratings in response to a variety of social targets. They completed trait compassion measures, and then 2 measures of compassionate behavior. And the way the task is structured, there were 40 trials of the AMP, like what I showed you before, that showed people crying and clear states of suffering. There were also 20 trials that were control trials. They were just simple gray squares that weren't meant to elicit a strong response. So this is what I showed you before. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. We had people rate their emotions towards a variety of targets. This included images like what you see there of someone crying, also people smiling, and people displaying neutral affect. We asked them 4 questions for each image. First, we asked them, do you feel anything? Do you identify with the person in the photo? Do you feel like helping? For our purposes, we collapsed these together as an index of compassion. However, if you focus just on the more compassion-like items, like the latter 2, you get the same results. And then an item that captures something like empathic distress. Do you feel anxious or uncomfortable? We included 2 measures of donation behavior, compassionate behavior. People watched a 2.5-minute video of child cancer patients and were then told they could contribute, they could donate raffle tickets for a prize to these patients. And they also completed the self-report altruism scale, which measures, as you might imagine, self-reported altruistic actions. We also had them complete 3 measures of trait compassion. Perhaps the most well-known is the Interpersonal Reactivity Index Empathic Concern subscale. All of these have people self-assess the degree to which they are compassionate on a day-by-day basis. So these are all the measures we included in this online study. Now for the results. So what we typically do is we compute the proportion of compassion responses for each trial type on the AMP, so for the suffering trials and for the neutral trials. As you might expect, people had a stronger implicit compassion response after suffering primes than after control primes. And in terms of our key outcomes, AMP compassion predicted increased state compassion, but not distress, suggesting emotion specificity. It predicted each of the trait compassion measures, and it predicted both donation behavior and self-reported altruism. So it appears this initial validation suggests that the compassion AMP has predictive and convergent validity. But it also has discriminant validity. So the relationships are content specific. If you recall, we computed the proportion of compassion responses on neutral prime trials as well. And those do not predict any of the outcomes listed above. And the effects also appear emotion specific. So you can compute the proportion of disgust responses on the AMP as well. That was an alternative emotion you could misattribute within the task. And that does not predict any of these relationships either. So we think, I'll end this part of the talk because I really want to get to the second half, which is rapidly going away. We think this could be a useful task to include among other measures in trying to assess compassion. Any reliable measure of compassion is going to have to be multimodal. It'll include self-reports, physiology, brain imaging, but we think that this task, the AMP and others like it, can be a useful addition to the toolbox. All right, I have 5.5 minutes to discuss the topic that I've been covering for the last 5 years. Okay, so what are the limits of compassion? You've probably all heard this quote, often attributed to Joseph Stalin. 1 death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic. Mother Teresa had said something in the same ballpark. If I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will. And both quotes seem to converge in this idea that when it comes to the suffering of many individuals, things like natural disasters, genocides, disease outbreaks, it can be challenging to feel empathy and compassion. More recently, Paul Bloom in The New Yorker wrote that empathy has some unfortunate features. It is parochial, narrow-minded, and innumerate, i.e. insensitive to large numbers. We're often at our best when we're smart enough not to rely upon it. So based upon the empirical premise that empathy and compassion are unresponsive to large-scale disasters, they're making the normative claim that compassion and empathy are difficult to trust. And then even more recently, Paul Slovic has argued that our capacity to feel sympathy for people in need appears limited, and this form of compassion fatigue can lead to apathy and inaction. What these quotes amount to is a claim about the capacity to feel compassion. They're suggesting that we have a limited, fixed resource capacity to feel compassion and to sympathize with others. But what I'll suggest is that apparent capacity limits are actually much more flexible. And they result from motivated choices, empathy avoidance, as Dan put it, to avoid empathy and compassion for others. And we can see these motivational dynamics playing out quite recently. Responses to the thousands of border children who crossed the southern border of the United States, with responses ranging from apathy to outright antagonism. And even more recently with the Ebola outbreak, where there's a large-scale apathy to the suffering overseas, and then antagonism once that disease is brought within the United States. So this is an issue that has a special relevance right now as we're facing very challenging compassionate contexts. So if I asked you to predict how much compassion would you feel for one suffering child or a group of suffering children, you might think that as the number of victims increases, your compassion would increase. You might forecast that your sympathy would go up as the numbers do as well. You might also think that as a matter of moral principle, that you should feel worse. If more people are suffering, given the irreducible value of each human life, you should feel more compassion and you should do more to help. But despite that prediction and despite that moral principle, the results are actually exactly the opposite. That as the numbers of victims in a crisis goes up, our compassion and donation behavior tend to decrease. And this has been called the compassion collapse, compassion fade. There's probably a dozen other terms for this effect. But the basic idea is that when compassion is needed the most, when the most people are suffering, we ironically appear to feel it the least. And that should be quite surprising to many of us, I think. We see this if you compare compassion and donation between one victim and lots of victims, like hundreds or thousands. One victim and a handful, like 8 or 12. And even 1 versus 2 is enough to trigger this drop-off in the compassion response. So this is highly replicable and very counterintuitive. And researchers are now trying to examine what are the psychological processes that cause this compassion collapse. One account is that there actually is a capacity limit. As the quotes alluded to earlier, there are differences in how we represent and attend to single victims as opposed to multiple victims that change how compassion unfolds in the first place. When I see the child on the left, I might be able to really concretely represent that child in my mind and attend to her suffering. But when faced with the group of victims on the right, that might be much more difficult. So in essence, it's a built-in emotional bias that we have little ability to override or to control. That's the argument. My past work suggests an opposing viewpoint that it's motivated choice. It's not a capacity limit. People anticipate they'll feel more compassion as the numbers increase. And with that anticipation might come concerns about the costs of compassion, concerns about the financial expense, emotional exhaustion, perhaps with Ebola, concerns about contamination. All of these things that are factors, they're motivations that could lead people to eliminate feelings of compassion, creating the appearance of a fixed limit. So with 20 seconds left, I do have data, and I'm happy to talk with any of you about this data after the talk. But what I guess I'll show you, I did have an experiment with graphs. Apologize for the time management. But we find basically that this compassion collapse changes depending upon people's motivation. It depends upon how well they can control their emotions, suggesting that it's not a fixed capacity limit, but it's due to motivated choices to strategically regulate compassion because of the anticipated costs. So if ever you read claims like the ones you saw earlier that we just cannot feel compassion for these kinds of large-scale natural disasters and genocides, realize this is based upon an empirical premise that we can test. And it looks like those limits are somewhat flexible. Although this is kind of a depressing topic, and a red light is blinking at me, I think the upshot is that we can motivate people to make different choices. If this is the end result of a motivated choice, we can shift people's perspectives and motivate increased compassion. So, thank you.
We have nearly 20 minutes for questions. And I suggest that we go around the panel. So can we start with any questions for Professor Gilbert?
I was intrigued by your description of the Buddhist thought for compassion of awakening the mind. I'm curious if that's similar to opening the heart, because I go back and forth between mind and heart in compassion.
No?
Yeah. Are we on? We're not on yet. Okay. 1, 2. Can we try another one? When I was in a pop band, oh, here we are.
Oh, you're good.
I was going to say, when I was in a pop band, they used to do this to me when I used to stand on stage. They would never let me have my mic on because I was such a terrible singer. So I just had a flashback. Okay, but it's a brilliant question. So the issue about the enlightened mind, right, is enlightened into the nature of reality. Now, Dr. Ekman touched on this, for the idea of the illusion of the sense of self. That's one aspect of the concept of the grasping self. So there are different levels of what they mean by enlightenment, which comes through a process of dedicated meditation. To enlighten the heart, which is the motivation for compassion, this is the importance of understanding how motivation kind of moves you forward and how it organizes your mind. Motivations are major organizers of the mind, right? So if you're motivated to make a lot of money, to be competitive, that's going to influence what you attend to, what you think about, the people you relate to, how you relate to those people. Whereas if you're motivated for compassion, the way you attend, the way you think, what gives you pleasure, what gives you pain, is going to be very different. So the idea of the compassion motivation is based upon this way in which you organize your mind according to the dedicated Bodhicitta, which is this desire to help all other sentient beings. The enlightenment component is the ability to see into the nature of mind itself, into the nature of reality, into the illusion of the self, the nature of consciousness, and so on. Now, in the Theravada traditions, these two are connected. So mindfulness is regarded as enough to awaken compassion. In the Mahayana and Tibetan traditions, it is not seen as enough. There are two very different practices for mindfulness practice and compassion practice. The Tibetan tradition is that you really have to develop the compassion as well as the mindfulness. I don't know if that's a fair answer.
A question for Professor Warneken.
I have a question for Dr. Warneken and also for Dr. Ekman. I was wondering if the results of your experiments in toddlers might be considered the manifestation of a polysynaptic reflex that is similar to the strong Babinski reflex or the strong Galant reflex that infants have at birth but then extinguish with time, that would be consistent with Dr. Ekman's statement earlier that sometime between 4 to 6 years of age, there's a loss of this spontaneous altruism, and that maybe our efforts as adults are to try to place a cognitive understanding on that reflexive behavior.
Well, I mean, I think that the fact that children help in so many different situations, including novel ones, speaks against some reflex that is triggered by this, at least as the main cause of this, because you have to make some inferences about what is going on. So there need to be, you can't explain it by a reflex alone. It has to go through at least a longer path of making inferences about goals to achieve that.
That's why I said polysynaptic reflex. It involves actually a multi-sensory input perception and then the processing of that, not as a spinal reflex.
Okay. So then, so it is still, okay. So if you call that a reflex, then fine. But I wouldn't call that a reflex if it's going through a decision tree of what to do in these kinds of things. So, but in any case, we don't want to talk about semantics here. But I think that the point is that I think that it is a process where a lot of learning is probably playing a role, where at least in the sense of being able to understand different kinds of situation and have experience about what is an appropriate goal in a certain situation, and so that children can really build upon that over development, so that it starts out with a maybe more primitive understanding of certain types of situation goal contingencies, but it becomes more complex over time. So I think that this is what is certainly the case here. And I would also add, this is research I couldn't talk about here, it's also not my own, but it is something where children make inferences like this, not just based upon their own behavior. So it's not something that it's just they witness something and then they are responding with an action to it. They're also able to track third-party interactions about cooperative or helping behaviors and make inferences about that. So it seems it's a really quite sophisticated and complex process. Did you want to?
No.
Okay.
So the next questions for Professor Batson.
You talked about the empathy avoidance, and then Daryl, you spoke a little bit about the compassion collapse. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you attribute like exhaustive media coverage on a particular, disaster or something negative? How does that contribute to empathy avoidance versus something that isn't covered quite so much?
You might want to make a distinction between empathy avoidance, which is trying to resist feeling an empathic response because of the anticipated costs. And I think Daryl and I would agree about, as he said, it's a sort of motivated strategy where, before you feel empathy, your motivation may be egoistic, that is, you don't want to incur the costs of having to deal with this, and so this is the crossing the street to avoid a homeless person, that sort of thing. As opposed to what's sometimes talked about as compassion fatigue, which is the number of times you have been exposed to this, the well may run dry in terms of your reaction. And certainly, with the number of different cases that come up, everyone has to sort of advertise itself as being unique. This is Katrina, it's different. This is the tsunami, it's different. But after a while, different becomes the same.
Thank you. And the last question for Professor Cameron.
I mentioned earlier about working on compassion for the earth, and then I was writing a note to ask you later on, and suddenly you said, we can motivate people to choose compassion. And I had figured some time ago the only way to start to mitigate harm to the earth is to start to work with those global leaders. So my question is, are you at a point where you can say, yes, we can help? We can help get to those leaders, because I don't think they're intentionally trying to harm the earth. But they're in strategic planning, as you may know. You look for the leverage point. And I think the leverage point is there with the leaders to make this a bottom line. So compassion for the earth is a bottom line.
So I definitely agree. I think when I heard your question earlier, I saw relevance to some of these bigger concerns. To the degree that you feel that climate change is something that's going to harm, millions and billions of people if not properly addressed, you could argue that for some people that perception is demotivating. It creates concerns about the financial resources that would be required to address this issue, emotional exhaustion from thinking about all the people who would be impacted by it. So I do think you could think about denial of climate change and responses to climate change through a similar theoretical framework. In terms of interventions, I think if you were to appeal to someone in positions of power, you'd want to humanize the story. You'd want to focus on sea levels rising in a specific coastal community. You'd want to put a face on the actual crisis. And then also, as part of that, try to diffuse any motivational resistances that might be in place. that might be discouraging compassion from happening. So, I mean, I think that that's a really interesting issue. Can we feel compassion for the earth? And it might present some of the same threats that were discussed earlier.
I would like to thank the panel for 4 very interesting talks. We could spend a lot more time on any one of them. You've got another hour and 15 minutes on the psychophysiology of compassion coming up. So I think out of respect to the audience, we should close now and give you a chance to stretch before the 11:30 session begins. Thank you.